The snow fell in heavy silence over the Blackwood estate, blanketing the wrought iron gates and stone walls that separated Lorenzo's world from everyone else's. At 42, Lorenzo Blackwood had perfected the art of isolation. His tailored black suit was impeccable despite the late hour, his dark hair swept back with precision. The visible tattoos creeping from his collar and cuffs told stories he never spoke aloud, stories written in ink and blood. Power had come to Lorenzo through ruthlessness, and it had cost him everything he'd once been. He was reaching for his keys, ready to disappear behind the fortress walls of his manor, when he heard it. A small voice, barely a whisper against the wind and snow. "Mister." Lorenzo's hand instinctively moved toward the weapon concealed beneath his coat. He turned, scanning the darkness with the practiced wariness of a man who'd survived 3 decades in the underworld. What he found stopped him cold. A little boy stood at the edge of his property, just outside the gate's sensor range. No more than 5 years old. He had dark, tousled hair dusted with snow, his small face pale beneath a worn navy jacket. A military green backpack hung from his narrow shoulders, far too large for his frame. His eyes, wide, dark, and filled with something Lorenzo recognized from a lifetime ago, locked onto the Mafia boss with desperate intensity. "Are you lost?" Lorenzo's voice came out harsher than intended, a reflex born from years of commanding fear. The boy shook his head slowly, taking one hesitant step forward. His small hands trembled, whether from cold or terror, Lorenzo couldn't tell. Then the child spoke the words that would shatter Lorenzo's carefully constructed walls. "My mom didn't wake up." The world seemed to stop. The falling snow suspended in midair. Lorenzo felt something crack deep in his chest, a place he'd thought dead for 20 years. He stared at the boy, at the terror and fragile trust warring in those young eyes, and felt his own face drain of color. "What do you mean?" Lorenzo heard himself ask, his voice stripped of its usual cold authority. He moved toward the gate, his expensive shoes crunching through fresh snow. "I tried to wake her," the boy continued, his voice breaking. "I shook her and called her name, but she won't open her eyes. She's on the floor. She's so cold." Tears began tracking down the child's frozen cheeks. "I didn't know what to do. I remembered she said your house was safe. That if anything happened, the big house had help." Lorenzo's mind raced with the efficiency that had built his empire, but beneath the tactical thinking ran a current of something unfamiliar, panic. He crouched down, bringing himself to the boy's eye level. The snow soaked through his expensive trousers. The cold bit through the fabric. He didn't notice. "What's your name?" "Caleb. Caleb Turner." "Caleb." Lorenzo's voice dropped to something almost gentle, a tone he'd forgotten he possessed. "I'm Lorenzo. Can you take me to her? Can you show me where your mother is?" The little boy nodded, reaching out with complete, devastating trust to take Lorenzo's hand. His small fingers were ice cold even through his thin gloves. Without hesitation, without calculation, Lorenzo gripped that tiny hand and let the child lead him away from the safety of his gates. They walked in silence, the Mafia boss and the frightened boy, moving through the snow-covered grounds toward the edge of the estate. Caleb led him past the security perimeter, beyond the reach of Lorenzo's cameras and guards, into a section of wooded land Lorenzo owned but rarely visited. There, hidden among the bare trees and drifted snow, sat a small, dilapidated cabin, a structure so weathered Lorenzo had forgotten it existed. Caleb produced a key from inside his jacket, his small hands fumbling with the old lock. Lorenzo's larger hands covered the boy's, steady despite the dread crawling up his spine, and turned the key. The door swung open to reveal a single room, barely larger than Lorenzo's walk-in closet. But it was clean, he noticed, meticulously maintained despite its poverty. A small space heater glowed in the corner. Children's drawings were taped to the walls with care. A threadbare blanket was folded neatly on the narrow cot. And there, just as Caleb had said, a woman lay motionless on the floor beside a second-hand couch. Lorenzo crossed the room in 3 strides, his fingers finding her neck, searching for the pulse he desperately needed to find. It was there, faint, irregular, but present. The woman was young, perhaps 30, with chestnut hair pulled back in a practical braid. Even unconscious, Lorenzo could see the exhaustion carved into her delicate features, the shadows beneath her eyes. Her skin burned with fever beneath his touch, her breathing shallow and labored. "Caleb, step back." Lorenzo's voice had returned to its command tone, but now it carried purpose beyond control. He pulled out his phone, dialing a number he used only in the direst circumstances. His personal doctor, a man bound to Lorenzo by loyalty, money, and mutually assured destruction. "Marcus, I have a situation. Medical emergency. A woman, approximately 30, unconscious, high fever, irregular pulse. No hospitals. No records. I need you at the North Woods, old gamekeeper's cabin. 10 minutes." As he relayed information in the clipped, coded language of his world, Lorenzo took in the devastating details of the room. Empty medicine bottles lined the small counter, antibiotics, fever reducers, all generic brands. A calendar hung on the wall, shifts marked in careful handwriting. Doubles, triples, overnight coverage. On the rickety table sat a stack of bills, all stamped in red, past due. Final notice. A single photograph was taped to the wall. Caleb as an infant, held by this same woman, both of them smiling in better times. The doctor arrived in 8 minutes, a black bag in hand and no questions on his lips. He'd learned long ago not to ask. Lorenzo stood back, still holding Caleb, who had buried his face in the Mafia boss's coat. The boy was trembling now, silent and terrified. Lorenzo found his hand moving instinctively, rubbing small circles on the child's back, whispering reassurances in a voice he hadn't used in decades. "Severe respiratory infection," Marcus announced quietly, checking the woman's vitals. "Pneumonia, advanced. She's dehydrated, malnourished." Without immediate intervention. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "What does she need?" Lorenzo's voice was steel. "Hospital. For antibiotics, fluids, monitoring." "No hospitals." The command was absolute. "What can you do here?" Marcus met Lorenzo's eyes, understanding passing between them. "I can stabilize her, start treatment, but she needs intensive care. Days, maybe a week. Somewhere secure, somewhere I can work without questions." Lorenzo's mind was already moving, calculating, planning with the precision that had made him untouchable. The Riverside safe house. It's empty, secure, fully stocked. No one knows about it except Dante and me. "Is she involved in your business?" Marcus asked carefully, preparing emergency treatment. Lorenzo looked down at the unconscious woman, at the evidence of her desperate struggle for survival, at the son who'd walked through a snowstorm to save her. "No," he said quietly. "She's running from something, and she's just become my business." Within the hour, Lorenzo had orchestrated an extraction that would leave no trace. His most trusted men, only two, bound to him by blood and years, moved Eleanor and Caleb to the safe house with the efficiency of a military operation. No records, no witnesses, no trail. And as Lorenzo watched the convoy disappear into the snowy night, he realized the truth that would change everything. The little boy who'd stood at his gate, clutching a green backpack and whispering words of terror, had just found the one weakness Lorenzo Blackwood had thought he'd buried forever. His humanity. The path through the snow-covered woods was barely visible, marked only by Caleb's small footprints from earlier that night. Lorenzo followed the boy deeper into the forgotten edge of his property, past the reach of security cameras and motion sensors, into a part of the estate he'd purchased years ago and never bothered to explore. His hand remained locked around Caleb's, the child's desperate grip somehow more binding than any contract Lorenzo had ever signed. The cabin emerged from the darkness like a ghost, weathered wood, a sagging porch, windows patched with cardboard against the winter cold. Lorenzo's mind was already calculating the risk. Someone had been living here, on his land, without his knowledge. That alone was a security breach that could cost lives in his world. But as Caleb fumbled with the key, his small hands shaking violently, Lorenzo found he didn't care about the breach. He cared only about what waited inside. The door swung open to reveal Eleanor Turner collapsed beside a threadbare couch. Her body curled on its side, as though she'd tried to reach for something before consciousness left her. Lorenzo crossed the small space in 2 strides, his fingers pressing against her neck. The pulse was there, weak and irregular, fluttering beneath skin that burned like fire. Her breathing came in shallow, labored gasps. Her lips had a faint blue tinge that made Lorenzo's stomach clench. "Mama." Caleb's voice was so small, so broken, that Lorenzo felt something inside him splinter. "She's alive," Lorenzo said firmly, though his trained eye saw what the boy couldn't. This woman was hours, maybe less, from critical organ failure. He pulled out his phone, then stopped. Hospital meant records. Records meant questions. Questions meant exposure. And exposure, in Lorenzo's world, meant death, not just for him, but for anyone connected to him. Could you really call 911 knowing it might save her life? Or would you protect your empire first? That's the choice weak men make. Lorenzo Blackwood had never been weak. He dialed Marcus instead, his private physician, a man whose loyalty had been purchased with enough money to ensure silence and enough secrets to guarantee it. North Woods. Old gamekeeper's cabin. Critical. 10 minutes. He ended the call and turned to Caleb, who stood frozen, his green backpack still strapped to his small shoulders, tears streaming down his face. Lorenzo knelt beside Eleanor, checking her pupils, her breathing, her skin temperature, all the emergency protocols he'd learned decades ago in a very different life. A life before power, before empire, before he'd learned that caring was a liability. But as Caleb crept closer, his small body trembling, Lorenzo found himself reaching out, pulling the boy against his side. "Your mother's strong," Lorenzo said quietly, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. "She's fighting, and I'm going to help her fight. If you believe families deserve protection from the systems that fail them, you know what to do. Only those who profit from suffering look away. The choice Eleanor never had is the choice we make right now." Marcus arrived in 8 minutes, materializing from the snowy darkness like a shadow. He was in his 50s, silver-haired and steady-handed, carrying the kind of calm that came from stitching bullet wounds in basements and asking no questions. He knelt beside Eleanor without a word, his practiced fingers checking vitals, pulling back eyelids, pressing a stethoscope to her chest. "Acute pneumonia," Marcus said quietly, his voice clinical but grave. "Advanced stage. Respiratory distress. She's severely dehydrated, malnourished. Her body's been fighting this for days, maybe a week." He looked up at Lorenzo, and something passed between them, the unspoken language of men who'd seen death too many times. "She needs a hospital, Lorenzo. ICU, for antibiotics, constant monitoring. Without it, she's got hours, not days." "No hospitals." Lorenzo's voice was granite. Marcus's jaw tightened. "Then I need equipment. A proper facility. This cabin. The Riverside house." Lorenzo was already moving, his mind shifting into the tactical mode that had kept him alive for 2 decades. "It's stocked. Medical supplies, monitoring equipment. You set it up last year for the Cordova situation. That's on the other side of the city. Moving her in this condition. Then stabilize her enough to move." It wasn't a request. Lorenzo pulled out his phone, typing a message in the coded shorthand only 3 people in the world understood. Within seconds, 2 names appeared on his screen: Dante and Marcus, his lieutenant and his enforcer, men whose loyalty had been forged in blood and tested by fire. "Do you think Eleanor chose to be in that cabin, sick and alone, or did a broken system put her there? Comment, systems fail people if you know the real enemy." 20 minutes later, an unmarked black SUV rolled silently through the woods, its headlights off, navigating by GPS and muscle memory. Dante emerged first, tall, scarred, his face expressionless as he assessed the situation with the efficiency of a career soldier. Marcus followed, younger but equally lethal, his tattooed hands already reaching for the medical kit Marcus was preparing. "No questions," Lorenzo said simply. Both men nodded. They'd learned long ago that Lorenzo's orders were absolute. But this was different. They saw it in his face, in the way he held the small boy against his side, in the careful way he watched Marcus work. Marcus inserted in 4-line, pumping fluids and emergency antibiotics into Eleanor's system. Her breathing stabilized slightly, enough for transport. They lifted her onto a collapsible stretcher with the practiced precision of men who'd moved bodies before, though never one they intended to save. Caleb's hand tightened around Lorenzo's. "Where are you taking her?" "Somewhere safe," Lorenzo said, crouching down to meet the boy's terrified eyes. "Somewhere with everything she needs to get better. And you're coming with us." The convoy moved through the night like ghosts. 3 vehicles, routes staggered, protocols followed with military precision. No cameras would catch them. No records would exist. By dawn, Eleanor Turner would be in a secure location that didn't officially exist, attended by a doctor who'd never been there, protected by men who left no trace. And Lorenzo Blackwood, the man who'd built an empire on ruthlessness, found himself holding a 5-year-old's hand in the back seat, whispering promises he had no business making. The Riverside safe house was a study in contradictions, luxurious but sterile, secure but suffocating. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a frozen river, the glass bulletproof and tinted against surveillance. Marcus had transformed the master bedroom into a makeshift ICU within an hour, monitors beeping softly as Eleanor lay unconscious, for lines snaking from her arms, oxygen mask covering her pale face. Caleb stood frozen in the doorway, his small frame rigid with terror, his green backpack still strapped to his shoulders like armor. He hadn't spoken since they'd arrived, hadn't cried, hadn't moved. He just stared at his mother with eyes too old for his face. "Caleb," Lorenzo said carefully, crouching beside the boy. "The doctor needs space to work. Why don't we?" "No." The word was barely a whisper, but it carried absolute conviction. "I'm staying with her." Lorenzo felt something foreign rise in his chest, helplessness. He could command armies of men, could orchestrate operations across 3 states, could end lives with a phone call. But he had no idea how to comfort a terrified 5-year-old. Marcus glanced up from checking Eleanor's vitals, his expression sympathetic but firm. "Lorenzo, he needs rest. Food. This is going to be a long night. I'm not leaving her." Caleb's voice cracked, tears finally breaking through. "What if she wakes up and I'm not here? What if she thinks I left her?" The words hit Lorenzo like a physical blow, dragging up memories he'd buried under decades of carefully constructed walls. He remembered being 7, watching his own mother's casket lowered into frozen ground, remembered the suffocating certainty that if he'd just stayed closer, been better, been more, she wouldn't have left him. Have you ever felt powerless to help someone you care about? That's the moment that changes everything. "Listen to me," Lorenzo said, his voice low and steady. He placed his hands on Caleb's small shoulders, feeling the boy tremble beneath his touch. "Your mother isn't going anywhere. I promise you that. But she needs the doctor to help her, and you need to be strong enough to be here when she wakes up. Can you do that?" Caleb's lower lip trembled. "I don't want to leave her." "You won't. Just the next room. You'll be close enough to hear her breathe." Lorenzo gestured toward the adjacent room, visible through an open door. "And I'll stay with you. Every minute. If anything changes, if she so much as moves, Marcus will get us immediately." The boy searched Lorenzo's face, looking for the lie, for the betrayal adults had probably taught him to expect. Whatever he saw there must have been enough, because he finally nodded, a tiny, defeated motion. Lorenzo guided Caleb into the guest room, all chrome and leather, designed for visiting associates, not frightened children. The boy looked impossibly small against the king-sized bed. Lorenzo found a blanket, the softest one in the closet, and draped it over Caleb's shoulders. "I don't know how to do this," Lorenzo admitted quietly, surprising himself with the honesty. "I don't know how to take care of kids, but I know how to keep promises." And I'm promising you right now, your mother will survive this night. Caleb's eyes, red-rimmed and exhausted, finally began to close. Lorenzo sat on the edge of the bed, his tailored suit incongruous against the domestic scene, his tattooed hands folded in his lap. Through the doorway, he could see Marcus working with quiet efficiency, could hear the steady beep of monitors tracking Eleanor's fragile heartbeat. If you stand with those who protect the vulnerable instead of abandoning them, hit subscribe. Only the cold-hearted walk away when children need help. The dawn broke cold and gray over the frozen river, pale light filtering through the bulletproof windows. Lorenzo hadn't slept. He'd spent the night in the chair beside Caleb's bed, watching the boy's fitful sleep, listening to the monitors in the next room track Eleanor's slow, steady improvement. Marcus had updated him at 3 a.m. Her fever was breaking, her breathing stabilizing. She would live. At 6:30, Lorenzo's phone buzzed with a reminder. The court of a meeting. $20 million in laundered real estate, 6 months of negotiation, everything riding on this morning's signature. He stared at the screen, then typed a single message to his lieutenant. Postpone. Family emergency. The word family felt strange under his fingers. Foreign. Dangerous. In the kitchen, Lorenzo faced a new kind of crisis. The safe house was stocked for his world. Aged whiskey, protein bars, black coffee. Nothing remotely suitable for a 5-year-old. He opened cabinets with growing frustration, finding only the essentials of a man who never stayed long enough to need more. What do children even eat? He settled on eggs. He could make eggs. The memory surfaced unbidden. 7 years old, standing on a chair in a cramped kitchen, his mother's hands guiding his as he whisked eggs in a chipped bowl. Gentle, Lorenzo. You're scrambling them, not punishing them. Her laugh, warm and bright, the last good memory before the cancer took her. Lorenzo cracked 4 eggs into a bowl, his movements mechanical. The pan heated. Butter sizzled. The familiar motions steadied something inside him, something that had been shaking since Caleb appeared at his gate. Is Mama awake? Lorenzo turned to find Caleb in the doorway, still wearing yesterday's clothes, his hair sticking up at odd angles, his green backpack clutched against his chest like a shield. Not yet, Lorenzo said gently. But she's better. The doctor says she's going to be okay. He gestured to the counter. Are you hungry? Caleb climbed onto a bar stool, his feet dangling far above the floor. He watched Lorenzo plate the eggs with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. They ate in silence, the only sound the scrape of forks against plates and the distant beep of medical monitors. Lorenzo had negotiated with cartel bosses and corrupt politicians, had stared down men twice his size without flinching, but sitting across from this small, broken boy felt like the hardest thing he'd ever done. We moved a lot, Caleb said suddenly, his voice small. Mama said we had to. She said someone was looking for us. Lorenzo's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Who was looking for you? I don't know. She never said his name. Just the bad man. Caleb pushed eggs around his plate. We lived in 7 places. I counted. Every time I made a friend, we had to leave again. 7 places. 7 times running. Lorenzo's mind shifted into the calculating mode that had kept him alive for decades. Eleanor wasn't just poor, she was hiding. And people only hid that desperately when the alternative was worse than poverty. Did this bad man ever find you? Lorenzo asked carefully. Caleb shook his head. Mama's really good at hiding. She always checks the windows before we go to sleep. She makes me memorize addresses in case we get separated. His voice dropped to a whisper. But this time she got sick, and I didn't know what to do. I was so scared. When children ask for help and adults ignore them, they learn the world is cruel. Comment, protect the innocent, if you believe no child should face that alone. Only those who create the fear stay silent. Lorenzo reached across the counter, his tattooed hand covering Caleb's small one. You did exactly the right thing. You found help. You saved her life. But what if the bad man comes while she's sick? What if he finds us here? Lorenzo's jaw tightened, something cold and lethal settling into his expression. Then he'll have to go through me first. Dante's call came at noon, his voice tight, with controlled urgency. "We have a problem. The Volkov crew has eyes on the manor. 3 cars, rotating shifts. They noticed the activity last night, the vehicles, the movement. They're asking questions." Lorenzo stepped into the hallway, pulling the door closed behind him so Caleb wouldn't hear. "How many?" "6 that we've identified. Could be more." Dante paused. "They think you're hiding something valuable. Or someone." The Volkovs. Russian syndicate, territorial and paranoid, always probing for weakness. If they discovered Eleanor and Caleb, they'd leverage them without hesitation. A single mother and child were perfect pressure points, fragile, easy to threaten, impossible to protect completely. "Double the perimeter security," Lorenzo ordered, his voice cold and clinical. "Rotate the teams. I want counter-surveillance on every Volkov operative. And Dante? If anyone gets within a mile of this location, I want to know before they take their next breath." "Understood. How long are you planning to stay dark?" Lorenzo glanced back toward the guest room where Caleb was supposedly resting. "As long as it takes." He ended the call and stood in the hallway, the weight of his empire pressing down like concrete. Every decision he'd made for 20 years had been calculated for maximum power, minimum vulnerability. He'd eliminated threats before they materialized, cut ties before they became liabilities, built walls so high that nothing could touch him. And now a 5-year-old boy with a green backpack had walked through every defense like they were made of paper. Through the doorway, Lorenzo watched Caleb sitting on the floor, playing with the only toy Lorenzo had managed to find, a deck of cards from the Safe House emergency kit. The boy was building a house of cards with intense concentration, his small hands steady despite everything he'd endured. "How easily do you think that house of cards will fall?" That's what Caleb's whole life has been, one breath away from collapsing. The card house trembled as Caleb placed the final card on top. For a moment, it held. Then a draft from the heating vent knocked it down, scattering cards across the hardwood floor. Caleb's face crumpled, and he started rebuilding immediately, his movements desperate, as though getting it right this time would somehow fix everything that was broken. Lorenzo felt something crack open inside his chest, a fissure in the armor he'd spent decades welding into place. He was 7 again, standing in a funeral home that smelled like lilies and lies, listening to distant relatives debate who would take him. None of them wanted the burden. He could see it in their faces, hear it in their careful pauses. "The boy's difficult," his aunt had whispered. "Always has been. His mother spoiled him." His mother hadn't spoiled him. She'd loved him. And when she died, that love died with her, leaving him alone in a world that viewed children as inconveniences and vulnerability as weakness. He remembered the group home, the older boys who taught him that kindness was currency you couldn't afford. He remembered Marcus, different Marcus, a teenager with dead eyes who'd shown him how to hurt people before they hurt you. He remembered the exact moment he'd buried his softness, wrapped it in concrete, and dropped it into the darkest part of himself. He'd been 9 years old when he learned that ruthlessness wasn't a choice, it was survival. Caleb looked up, catching Lorenzo watching him. "It keeps falling down," he said quietly, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I can't make it stay." Lorenzo crossed the room and knelt beside the boy, his expensive suit creasing against the floor. "That's because you're building it alone," he said, picking up a card. "Here, let me help." Together, they rebuilt the house of cards, Caleb's small hands working alongside Lorenzo's tattooed ones. This time, when they placed the final card, it held. "If you believe no child should have to build their life alone while predators circle, subscribe. Only those who profit from broken families stay silent." Eleanor's eyes opened on the 3rd day, flickering beneath heavy lids as consciousness fought its way through fever and medication. Lorenzo was there when it happened, had been sitting in the chair beside her bed for the past hour while Marcus checked vitals and Caleb slept in the next room. Her gaze found him immediately, sharp, despite the weakness, assessing the threat with the instinct of someone who'd learned to calculate danger in seconds. Her hand moved beneath the blanket, searching for something that wasn't there. Searching for Caleb. Your son is safe? Lorenzo said before she could panic. He's sleeping in the next room. He hasn't left your side for 3 days. Eleanor's throat worked, dry and raw. Marcus handed Lorenzo a cup of water, and he held it to her lips, watching her drink with the wariness of a cornered animal accepting help from a predator. Who are you? Her voice was barely a whisper, scraped raw from the oxygen mask. Lorenzo Blackwood. He let the name settle, watching recognition flicker across her pale face. Good. She knew who he was. That made this easier. And you've been living in a condemned cabin on my property for approximately 6 weeks. I want to know why. Eleanor's jaw tightened, her fingers gripping the blanket. We'll leave. As soon as I can walk, we'll be gone. You'll never see us again. That's not what I asked. Lorenzo leaned forward, his voice dropping to the tone that made grown men confess sins they'd buried for decades. You're running. 7 addresses in 3 years, according to your son. You're hiding from someone dangerous enough that you'd rather risk pneumonia in a shack than seek proper help. So I'll ask you again, who are you running from? That's none of your business. You made it my business when your son walked through a snowstorm to my gate. Lorenzo's voice was steel-wrapped in ice. When he looked at me with terror in his eyes and said his mother wouldn't wake up. When I moved you to a secure location and put my own operation at risk to save your life. So yes, Eleanor, it's very much my business now. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, but her voice remained steady. A debt collector. His name doesn't matter. What matters is that he won't stop looking until he finds us. What kind of debt? Medical bills. My mother's cancer treatment. Eleanor's hands trembled as she spoke. $50,000. I couldn't pay it. He said he'd forgive the debt if I'd work for him instead. I refused. He said if I ran, he'd make sure Caleb understood the cost of my choice. The implication hung in the air like poison. Lorenzo's expression didn't change, but something dark and lethal moved behind his eyes. He threatened your son. He threatened everything. Eleanor's fierce maternal love blazed through her weakness. He has connections, law enforcement, courts, social services. He said he'd make sure Caleb was taken from me, that I'd never see him again, that my son would grow up knowing his mother abandoned him. Who do you think is more dangerous, the man who threatens children or the man who protects them? Let us know in the comments. Lorenzo understood debt. He understood leverage. But he also understood loyalty, and watching this woman, weak, desperate, half dead from infection, still fighting to protect her son, triggered something he'd thought he'd killed years ago. Respect. This collector, Lorenzo said carefully. Does he know about my property? No. I found the cabin by accident. It was abandoned, off any map. I thought we'd be safe there, just for a few months until I saved enough to move again. Her voice cracked. I never meant to involve you. I never meant for Caleb to. Your son saved your life. And in doing so, he's given me information I needed. Lorenzo stood, straightening his suit jacket. You're going to stay here until you're strong enough to walk. Then we're going to discuss your options. I don't have options, Eleanor whispered. You didn't. Now you do. 5 days after Eleanor opened her eyes, Marcus delivered his final assessment in the sterile quiet of the safe house kitchen. She's stable. Infections cleared. Lungs are functioning normally. Vitals are strong. She needs rest, proper nutrition, and follow-up care, but medically speaking, she can leave whenever you decide. Lorenzo stood at the window overlooking the frozen river, his reflection ghost-like in the bulletproof glass. Behind him, through the open door, he could hear Caleb's laughter, a sound that had grown more frequent over the past days. The boy was teaching Eleanor a card game, their voices soft and warm, the sound of a family stitching itself back together. Whenever I decide, Lorenzo repeated, the words tasting like ash. Marcus packed his medical equipment with practiced efficiency. What are you going to do? It was the question Lorenzo had been avoiding for 5 days. The logical answer was simple. Give Eleanor enough money to disappear, erase any trace of their connection, return to the empire that demanded his complete attention. Clean, efficient, safe. But logic had abandoned him the moment Caleb's small hand gripped his in the snow. If I send them away, Lorenzo said quietly. The debt collector finds them within a month. Maybe less. Eleanor's too weak to run, too broke to hide effectively. Caleb ends up in the system, or worse. That's not your responsibility. Lorenzo turned from the window, his expression carved from stone. Then whose responsibility is it? The system that failed them? The society that walks past children asking for help? The world that turns poverty into a death sentence? Marcus met his gaze, something like understanding passing between them. You're risking everything. The Volkovs are still watching. Your organization is asking questions. Every day you stay dark, you lose control. I know, and you're doing it anyway. Lorenzo thought about Caleb building houses of cards that kept falling, about Eleanor's fierce maternal love burning through fever and fear, about the 7-year-old boy he'd been, alone in a world that valued power over compassion, control over connection. He thought about the man he'd become to survive, and the man he might still be if he made a different choice right now. I'm doing it anyway, Lorenzo confirmed. That night, Lorenzo found himself in the guest room doorway, watching Caleb sleep. The boy had finally relaxed, his small body no longer curled in defensive tension, his green backpack resting on the chair instead of clutched against his chest. Trust, Lorenzo realized, looked like this: a child sleeping soundly because someone promised to stand guard. When had he last felt that kind of trust? When had he last been someone worthy of it? The answer was 20 years ago, before he'd learned that caring was weakness and attachment was liability. Before he'd built an empire on the ashes of his humanity. Eleanor appeared beside him, moving slowly, one hand braced against the wall for support. She looked at her son with the expression every mother wore, love mixed with terror at how fragile, how precious, how impossible it was to keep them safe. You don't have to do this, she whispered. We can leave tomorrow. I'll find a way. To what? Another cabin? Another city? Lorenzo's voice was low, careful not to wake Caleb. How many times can you run before you can't run anymore? How many times before Caleb stops believing you can keep him safe? Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. What are you suggesting? That running ends here. Lorenzo turned to face her, and for the first time in decades, he let someone see past the armor. That Caleb deserves a childhood that doesn't involve counting addresses and checking windows. That you deserve to stop looking over your shoulder. I can't pay you back, whatever this costs. I'm not asking you to. Do you believe everyone deserves a chance to stop running? Or should the vulnerable just keep hiding until they're caught? The answer matters more than you think. The weight of the decision settled over them like snow, quiet, inevitable, transforming everything it touched. Lorenzo Blackwood, who'd spent 20 years ensuring he needed no one, had just discovered that needing someone wasn't weakness. It was the only thing that made you human. Lorenzo waited until morning to make his offer, orchestrating the moment with the same precision he applied to every negotiation that mattered. Eleanor sat across from him at the safe house table, Caleb playing with cards in the next room, Marcus having departed an hour earlier with instructions to prepare what came next. I have a proposition, Lorenzo began, his voice carrying the weight of finality. And I need you to listen to all of it before you respond. Eleanor's hands wrapped around her coffee mug, knuckles white. She nodded, her eyes wary but alert. I own a residential building in the downtown district. Secure, gated, 24-hour surveillance. There's a 3-bedroom unit on the 8th floor that's been sitting empty for 6 months. It's yours. Fully furnished, utilities included, maintained by my people. I can't afford. I'm not finished. Lorenzo's tone wasn't harsh, but it stopped her mid-sentence. You need income. Legitimate income that won't raise questions. I have a consulting firm, Blackwood Securities. On paper, it's corporate security analysis. In reality, it handles risk assessment for my legitimate holdings. Real work, real salary, full benefits including the medical coverage you've been avoiding for 3 years. Eleanor stared at him, trying to find the trap, the angle, the inevitable cost. Why would you do this? Because the alternative is unacceptable. Lorenzo leaned forward, his tattooed hands flat on the table. If you leave here, The debt collector finds you. Maybe not today, maybe not next month, but eventually. And when he does, Caleb loses you, either to his threats, to the system, or to your desperation. I won't allow that. You won't allow it? Eleanor's voice shook with anger and confusion. You don't know us. We're nothing to you. You're wrong. Lorenzo's expression softened in a way that would have shocked anyone who knew him. 5 nights ago, your son walked through a snowstorm to ask a stranger for help. He stood at my gate, terrified, and trusted me with the most important thing in his world, you. That kind of bravery doesn't come from nothing. It comes from a mother who taught him that asking for help isn't weakness, that fighting for the people you love matters more than pride. Eleanor's tears fell silently, tracking down her pale cheeks. Caleb reminded me of something I'd forgotten, Lorenzo continued, his voice dropping to something raw and honest. That caring about someone isn't a liability. It's the only thing that makes survival worth the cost. My mother died when I was 7. I spent the next 20 years making sure I'd never need anyone again, never be vulnerable again. I built an empire on that principle, and your son shattered it in 5 minutes. What do you want from us? Your loyalty, your absolute silence about my world, my business, everything you see and hear. You work for me. You live under my protection. You accept that your safety is now tied to my reputation. Lorenzo's gaze was steady, uncompromising. And I want to be part of Caleb's life. Not as a father, I don't know how to be that, but as someone who keeps promises. Someone who shows him that the world isn't just people who walk past children asking for help. Eleanor searched his face for the lie, for the manipulation she'd learned to expect from powerful men. And if I say no, then I'll give you $50,000 and a new identity, and you'll disappear. But we both know how long that money lasts, and we both know running is just dying slowly. Lorenzo's voice turned to steel. This is the only real choice you've had in 3 years. Take it. If you stand with those who offer second chances instead of exploitation, like this video, only those who profit from desperation stay silent. Eleanor looked toward the doorway where Caleb was building another house of cards, his small face serious with concentration. She thought about 7 addresses, 7 times explaining to her son why they had to leave everything behind again. 7 times watching him lose friends, schools, the small pieces of childhood she couldn't protect. I accept, she whispered. But if you ever threaten him, if you ever use him against me, I won't. Lorenzo extended his hand across the table. You have my word. And in my world, that's the only currency that matters. Eleanor took his hand, sealing a deal that was equal parts salvation and surrender, and wondered if she'd just made the best decision of her life or traded one prison for another. The handshake lasted 3 seconds, but it rewrote the architecture of Lorenzo's carefully constructed world. Eleanor's grip was surprisingly strong for someone who'd nearly died a week ago, her palm warm against his, her eyes holding a promise that matched his own. Protection in exchange for loyalty, safety purchased with silence, a family forged from desperation and choice. We have an understanding, Lorenzo said, releasing her hand. Dante will move you to the apartment tomorrow. Everything you need will be there. You start at Blackwood Securities on Monday. Remote work until you're fully recovered. Eleanor nodded, then looked toward Caleb. He's going to ask questions. About you. About why we're staying. Tell him the truth, that I'm someone who keeps promises. Lorenzo stood, straightening his suit jacket. And Eleanor? The debt collector's name. I need it. She hesitated only a moment. Marcus Verizon. He operates out of Newark. Not anymore, Lorenzo said quietly, and the promise in those 2 words made Eleanor shiver. 3 months later, Lorenzo stood at the edge of Riverside Park, his coat collar turned up against the early spring wind, watching Caleb play on the swings. The boy had gained weight, his cheeks no longer hollow, his laughter ringing out as Eleanor pushed him higher. They looked normal, a mother and son enjoying a Saturday afternoon, nothing to suggest the shadows they'd escaped or the man who now stood guard over their ordinary life. Dante appeared at Lorenzo's side, silent as smoke. The Volkovs backed off. Word on the street is they think you've gone soft, spending time on charity cases. Let them think what they want. And Verizon? Disappeared. His operations been absorbed by the Castellano family. His files, including Eleanor's debt, were destroyed in a very unfortunate office fire. Lorenzo's expression remained neutral. Problem solved. Dante studied his boss with the careful attention of someone who'd served him for 15 years. You're different. Am I? You postponed the court of a deal. You've moved two major operations because they conflicted with personal commitments. You smiled last week during the quarterly meeting. Dante's voice held genuine confusion. Who are you and what have you done with Lorenzo Blackwood? Lorenzo watched Caleb jump from the swing, his green backpack bouncing, his small hand reaching for Eleanor's. The boy was talking animatedly, probably describing the height he'd achieved, the wind in his face, the ordinary magic of childhood that Lorenzo had forgotten existed. I'm the same man, Lorenzo said quietly. I'm just remembering what I was fighting for. His phone buzzed. 3 urgent messages about a shipment delay, a territorial dispute, a meeting that required his immediate attention. The Empire demanded its price, as it always did. But for the first time in 20 years, Lorenzo didn't feel the familiar urgency, the compulsive need to control every variable, to eliminate every vulnerability before it could be exploited. He felt something else instead, something that made his chest tight and his hands unsteady. He felt alive. Caleb spotted him across the park and waved, his whole face lighting up with recognition and trust. Eleanor followed her son's gaze, and something passed between her and Lorenzo. Acknowledgement of the impossible thing they'd built together, the unconventional family that existed in the spaces between his world and hers. Lorenzo raised his hand in return, a gesture so simple it should have been meaningless. But it wasn't. It was everything. You know they make you vulnerable, Dante said, not unkindly. Every enemy you've ever made will see them as leverage. The Volkovs, the Castellanos, even people inside your own organization. They'll use that boy and his mother against you the first chance they get. I know. And you're accepting that risk anyway. Lorenzo turned to face his lieutenant, and for once, he let Dante see past the armor. For 20 years, I've built an empire that no one can touch. I've eliminated threats, accumulated power, ensured my survival through absolute control. And every night, I went to bed knowing I'd won, knowing I was untouchable, knowing I'd never be weak again. He paused, watching Caleb run toward the playground. I was also completely alone, and I was dying inside without even realizing it. Dante said nothing, but his expression shifted, something like understanding, something like respect. That boy walked through a snowstorm to save his mother, Lorenzo continued. He trusted a stranger with everything he had because he believed people could be good, that help existed if you were brave enough to ask for it. His mother spent 3 years running, sacrificing everything, because her son's safety mattered more than her own survival. That's not weakness, Dante. That's the strongest thing I've ever seen. Do you think real power comes from control or from having something worth protecting? Your answer reveals everything. Caleb had reached the playground now, climbing the structure with the fearless confidence of a child who finally felt safe. Eleanor stood watch, her hand shading her eyes against the spring sun, her smile genuine for the first time since Lorenzo had met her. The Empire still stands, Lorenzo said, answering Dante's unspoken question. My operations continue. My power remains intact. But now I have something I never had before, a reason to use that power for something other than survival. A purpose, Dante said. A family. The word felt strange in Lorenzo's mouth, weighted with meanings he was still learning to understand. But as he watched Caleb play, as he caught Eleanor's grateful glance across the distance, he realized he'd finally found what 20 years of ruthless ambition couldn't buy. He'd found his humanity, and it was terrifying, inconvenient, dangerous, and absolutely worth every risk. Subscribe if you believe redemption is possible. Only those who've given up on second chances won't. The choice you make here is the choice Lorenzo made in the snow. To care, even when it costs everything. Lorenzo's phone buzzed again. Dante needed an answer. The Empire needed its master. The world of shadows and power needed him to return. But for just one more moment, Lorenzo stood in the spring sunshine, watching a little boy with a green backpack teach him what it meant to be alive. And for the first time in 20 years, Lorenzo Blackwood felt like he'd finally come home.